Let's think about the journey of a single meal. I mean, it's a trip we all take several times a day without a second thought. But for some animals, this simple passage is just filled with these bizarre detours, unexpected obstacles, and some seriously dangerous roadblocks. So today, we're going to take a guided tour of one of the body's most underappreciated organs, the esophagus. Let's dive in.
So to kick things off, here's a little pop quiz for you, just to challenge what you think you know about this supposedly simple tube. What could a house cat's esophagus possibly have in common with a fish? Really think about it. The answer is, well, it's pretty surprising.
And there it is, a herringbone pattern. You know, in cats, this beautiful, intricate design isn't a problem. It's not a sign of disease, it's just normal. It's how they're built. This is our very first clue that when it comes to biology, what we think of as normal isn't always what we're going to find. Which brings us right to our first section. You see, before we can even begin to understand what goes wrong on this journey, we have to appreciate the incredible, and sometimes just plain weird, variations of a totally normal, healthy esophagus. Take a pig's esophagus, for example. The upper part looks pretty standard, but then you get to the lower part, and wow, the muscle is incredibly thick. It's like night and day. But this isn't a disease. It's a completely normal feature in both pigs and horses. And the weirdest part? We don't actually know why it's like that.
And you know, that uncertainty brings up one of my absolute favorite ideas in science. When you hear a doctor say something is idiopathic, it's not really a diagnosis. It's an admission. It's science being humble, basically saying, we have no idea yet. It's just a perfect reminder that there are still so many mysteries out there left to solve.
Okay, so let's move on to our first major obstacle. What happens when the journey just stalls out before it even gets started? This is where the simple act of swallowing completely breaks down. So, the fancy medical term for this whole mess is dysphagia, and it's not really a single disease but more of a symptom that something has gone wrong in one of three critical phases of swallowing. It basically leaves that poor meal stranded at the station.
So the problem can pop up at three different points along the way. First, in the oral phase, it could be something as simple as a painful blister in the mouth. Then, in the pharyngeal phase, you've got issues further back, like tonsillitis, what we'd call a classic sore throat. And finally, in the esophageal phase, the food gets all the way to the entrance but just can't get in, usually because of some kind of neurologic issue.
Now for something way more dramatic. This isn't just a stall. This is total gridlock, a complete and total blockage of the highway. It's a condition we just call choke.
So, to really get a handle on how high the stakes are, picture this. A cow munches on a big apple, swallows it whole, and it gets stuck. Now that sounds bad, obviously, but why is this a full-blown, lights and sirens, life-or-death emergency?
Well, it's all about this lethal chain reaction. See, that stuck apple doesn't just block food. It blocks gas. Cows are constantly producing fermentation gas in their rumen, and they have to burp to release it. With the exit blocked, that gas just builds and builds, and the rumen swells up like a balloon. That's bloat. It gets so big, it literally crushes the lungs and heart, leading to shock and, yeah, a very, very rapid death.
And even if the animal makes it through the initial crisis, the road can be permanently damaged. The pressure can create scar tissue, called a stricture, that permanently narrows the highway. Or worse, a sharp object could cause a perforation, a literal puncture in the road. Or it could create something called a diverticulum, which is basically a dangerous pothole where food can get trapped and just fester. All right, so we've gone from a sudden blockage to a chronic failure. This isn't a temporary roadblock. This is the entire highway becoming a useless, sagging parking lot. The condition? It's called megaesophagus. So, what causes this? Well, it usually boils down to one of three things. Some animals are just born with it, a congenital defect where the nerves don't fire correctly. Others can get it as adults from neuromuscular diseases that basically paralyze the esophagus. And then there's the vascular ring anomaly, which is this fascinating embryological oopsie where a blood vessel grows in the wrong place and ends up trapping the esophagus, squeezing it from the outside.
Okay, so we've looked at failures of swallowing, and we've seen total blockages. But what happens when the threat isn't a blockage, but damage to the road itself? Let's talk about dangers that come from inside the esophageal wall.
When you see the esophageal ulcers, you're usually looking at one of three main culprits: First up, you've got gastric acid splashing up from the stomach, basically a chemical burn from reflux. Second, toxins, like the nasty stuff from blister beetles that can end up in hay. And third, certain drugs, like common anti-inflammatories, which can weaken the lining's natural defenses, leaving it totally vulnerable to damage.
And sometimes the threat is alive. We're talking parasites, and they range from harmless to absolutely deadly. On one hand, you've got Gongolia. I mean, look at those beautiful winding tracks it leaves. It's almost artistic, and it causes very little harm. But on the other hand, you have the true villain of the story, Spirocerca lupi. This thing is a dangerous squatter that causes severe inflammation and can actually trigger cancerous tumors. A real nasty customer. All right, for our final section, it is your turn to play detective. We're going to look at a couple of quick case files. Let's see if you can use what we've talked about to solve these little mysteries. Ready? Here we go, case file number 1. We've got a very sick, very weak goat, and at necropsy, its esophagus is just coated in these thick white plaques. So, what's the diagnosis? If you guessed a fungal infection, you are absolutely right. This is candidiosis, or what you might know as thrush. But here's the real key takeaway. Thrush is never the primary problem. It's an opportunist. Finding it means that goat's immune system was already tanked by some other, much more severe disease, which allowed the fungus to move in. It's a giant red flag for a much deeper issue.
Okay, on to case file number 2. A cat has a history of constantly regurgitating its food. Sadly, it ends up dying from pneumonia. When the vets examine it, they find its esophagus is just massive. So how are those 3 things, the regurgitation, the pneumonia, and that giant esophagus, all connected?
And the culprit is that massive esophagus. That's our megaesophagus. Because it couldn't move food down properly, the cat would constantly regurgitate. And tragically, during one of those episodes, it must have accidentally inhaled some of that material. That leads to aspiration pneumonia, a classic and all too often fatal complication of this condition.
And that brings us to the end of our tour. You know, we started with what seemed like a simple tube, and we ended up finding bizarre anatomy, lethal traffic jams, and hidden invaders. It really leaves you with one final thought. If something as simple as the esophagus is this complex, what other incredible secrets is biology hiding from us right there in plain sight?